poverty. From a logical point of view, how does a simple man from the slums become rich? Not including criminal means or beautiful stories about people becoming millionaires overnight. The rags to riches story is very difficult. Explain using only common sense. So what, you may ask, is the use of logic? Transurfing does not entirely fit into the framework of common sense. On the other hand, it does enable you to achieve things that would otherwise appear impossible. When your actions are based on logical deduction, you get a corresponding result. If a person is born in poverty, they will be accustomed to living in poor circumstances, and their energy will be attuned to the frequency of their own misfortune. It is very difficult to shift to a lifeline of prosperity if you despise your own poverty, envy the wealthy, and constantly wish you were better off. Actually, I would say that with these three types of thought in mind, it is totally impossible. One of the first discoveries children make as they get older is the fact that just because you would hate for something to happen, it does not mean you can avoid it happening. Sometimes the soul simply cries out in despair, "But I don't want to. I hate it. Why does this always happen to me?" It is not only children who ask themselves this question in fits of anger, but adults too. It is difficult to accept the fact that even though you do not want something to happen, there is nothing you can do about it. And if you hate something, it will follow you around wherever you go. You can harbor a hatred for poverty, your work, your physical flaws, your neighbors, drunks, alcoholics, drug addicts, dogs, thieves, criminals, the impudent child, the government. The list goes on. The more you love to hate something, the more likely you are to have experience of it in your life. The reason for this is clear. When something gets to you, you think about it, which means that you radiate energy at the frequency of a lifeline, where that thing exists in abundance. It does not matter which polarity you embody, liking or not liking. The second is of greater benefit to the pendulum because emotions associated with not liking are more powerful than emotions associated with liking. The destructive pendulum sways even higher when you are suffering emotionally. Finally, when you actively hate something, you create excess potential. Balanced forces are then directed against you because it is easier for them to eliminate one opponent than to change a world that does not suit one individual. Who would have thought there could be so many harmful aspects to a negative attitude towards life? In the case of the individual who is born in poverty but dreams of becoming rich, we know that desire itself is not enough to initiate change. Often, people do their dreaming lounging about on the sofa, having the occasional stretch, and thinking how much they would like a bowl of strawberries, but not knowing where to get them in the middle of winter. If you are not prepared to take action to acquire what you want, you will not get it. A poor person usually does not take action because of their own conviction that the fulfillment of their desire is not realistic. It is a vicious circle. Desire of itself has no power. Desire fails even to lift a finger. Intention, that is, the readiness to act, is the force that lifts the finger. With intention, a person could just as easily say, "You can't take this away from me. It's simple. I just want to be rich." Again, there's a huge chasm between wanting and being ready to become. For example, A poor person tends to feel out of place in the company of the wealthy or an expensive shop, even if they are desperately trying to convince themselves and others that the opposite is true, because in their heart, they believe that they are not worthy of that environment. Wealth is not part of a poor person's comfort zone, and not because it is uncomfortable to be wealthy, but because it is so unfamiliar. A new armchair is better, but the old armchair is more comfortable. A poor person only sees the external side of wealth: luxurious houses, expensive cars, ornaments, clubs, etc. If you placed a poor person in this type of environment, they would feel uncomfortable. And if you were to give them a suitcase full of money, they would do all sorts of foolish things with it until they had spent it all. The frequency of energy a poor person transmits is sharply dissonant with that of a wealthy life. Until a person lets the attributes of wealth into their comfort zone, and until they learn how it feels to be the owner of expensive things, they will remain poor, even if they find a buried treasure. Another obstacle on the path to wealth is envy. To envy someone means to be annoyed by someone else's success. There is nothing constructive about envy at all. In fact, it has a very strong destructive element. A person's psyche works in such a way that if they envy something that another has, they try to devalue it in every way possible. This is the logic of being green with envy. I envy what he has. I don't have it and probably never will have. He is no better than I am. That thing he has can't be that good then. Perhaps I don't need it after all. The desire to possess something is transformed into a psychological defense, which then develops into rejection. The aspect of rejection takes place on a subtle level because the subconscious mind takes everything literally. Your conscious mind only plays at devaluing the object of envy to comfort the person for not having it. But the subconscious mind takes it all seriously and bends over backwards to make sure that the person does not receive what has been so ardently devalued. You can see what tenacious forces hold a person to their lifeline of poverty. Events can unfold even more dramatically when a person undergoes an induced transition from a lifeline of prosperity to a lifeline of destitution. It does sometimes happen that a successful person suddenly loses everything and ends up on the street. The most insidious thing about an induced transition to poverty is that the spiral begins to unwind slowly and then picks up speed until there is no stopping it. The spiral starts with temporary financial difficulties. Anyone can experience temporary financial difficulties. They are an inevitable part of life, just like rain on the day you plan for a picnic. As long as you do not get angry about it, depressed, excessively anxious, or resentful, being deprived of a potential source of energy, the pendulum will come to rest. The induced shift only occurs if you somehow take a grip of the spiral's tail. The spiral can only start turning if you react to the destructive pendulum. A person's initial response is often to be disappointed. This is quite a weak source of energy. So if the emotional response stops here, the pendulum will be stilled. Anger and resentment are stronger forms of emotional response, which might lift the pendulum's spirits enough for it to convey the information that someone else is to blame for the person's financial difficulties. Their response to this second prod might be making negative comments, taking action against those who are supposedly to blame. By this time, the pendulum will be quite revived and begin the second turn of the spiral. At this stage, the person may receive a reduced income payment, prices may rise, or some debt might suddenly be called in. At this stage, the person probably does not realize that a process has been set in motion. It could seem to be nothing more than the result of unfortunate circumstances, whereas in actual fact, it is the result of a directed process, which has been induced by responding emotionally to the pendulum's prod. The frequency of that person's energy will continue to change from a vibration characteristic of a prosperous lifeline to a vibration characteristic of a new lifeline in which they suffer deprivation and annoyance. As a result, they shift to lifelines that correspond to a new set of financial circumstances. The situation is compounded, and bad news starts to come in from all sides. Prices rise, and their company's performance level drops. They discuss the problem with close friends and relatives, and the conversations are usually of a destructive nature, full of complaint, resentment, and aggression towards the guilty party. This can be particularly pronounced in companies where business is especially bad, and the working day begins with the statement that there's no money coming in, as solemnly as if it were a morning prayer. At this stage, the person is totally gripped by the spiral, and their energy attuned to the frequency of the destructive pendulum. Seeing that things are consistently getting worse, they become stressed and anxious. Despite its relatively insignificant magnitude, the pendulum can easily assimilate the energy of anxiety, and so it becomes all the more audacious. Because the adherent is so stressed, they inevitably generate excess potential, discontent, aggression, depression, apathy, resentment, and so on. As balanced forces connect with the pendulum, the situation snowballs out of control. The fear they begin to experience drives them to distraction, and things become frantic. It is as if someone has taken them by the hands, spun them round and round, only to let go abruptly, making them fly off to one side. The poor adherent falls to the ground where they lie in a state of shock. The finale is not a pretty picture, although it all started with just a few financial difficulties. Of course, it is not money that the pendulum needs so much as the negative energy a person generates when they realize that their money is literally going down the drain. By the time the spiral has unwound itself, the unfortunate individual has at best lost much of their wealth, and at worst lost everything they had, at which point they are no longer of any interest to the pendulum, as there is nothing more that can be gained from them. The unfortunate adherent will either remain lying in shock on the unsuccessful lifeline, or try with difficulty to pick themselves up from the floor. Such an induced transition can happen to a private individual as easily as to a large group of people. In the latter case, as you can imagine, the spiral is like a massive whirlpool from which it is impossible to escape. The only way to avoid an induced transition is to avoid gripping onto the tail of the spiral, thereby avoiding getting caught up in the pendulum's destructive game. It is not sufficient to know how the mechanism works. To remain free of the pendulum's power, you must maintain a constant awareness of it. You must not allow your inner guardian to doze off. Pull yourself up every time you realize that, out of habit, as if in a dream, you have accepted a pendulum's game. That is, you have expressed discontentment, indignation, anxiety, or contributed to a destructive discussion, and so on. Remember, Everything that causes you to express a negative reaction is a provocative prod from a destructive pendulum. The same thing happens when you are dreaming. Until you realize that what you are seeing is a dream, you are simply a pawn in someone else's game, and there is nothing to stop you from being tormented by nightmares. As soon as you wake up, shake off the delusion and realize the nature of the game. You are in control. When you do this, you will no longer be the victim of circumstances, while everyone around you continues to exist in a zombie-like state. Summary: everyone creates the separate layer of their own world. The world of humanity consists of individual layers, placed one on top of the other. When a person emanates negative energy, they compromise the quality of their own life layer. Aggression is mistakenly taken to be a strength and dissatisfaction as a normal reaction. Reacting to negative events induces a shift to negative lifelines. An induced transition is accompanied by a negative event in a personal life layer. Do not allow negative information into your layer. Do not allow does not mean strive to avoid, but rather to intentionally ignore, to express no interest.